Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I'll be doing another book review and I am super pumped to talk about this book because I absolutely adored it. And this book is called The Great Alone by Kristin Hannah. So let's just get right into it. So every time I pick up one of her books, I'm always part scared and part excited. Part scared because one, her books are always very big. They're always a bit daunting. And also because I've set the bar so high for her books that if it's anything less than amazing, I end up being disappointed. And part excited because I cannot wait to see what's in store for me. That being said, this book was amazing. Definitely one of my top 10 books already for this year. So anyways, moving on to my non-spoiler / summary of this book. So this book is mostly told in third person and is mostly from Lennie's perspective. Lennie is the daughter, by the way. So this book starts off with Ernst. I'm hoping I pronounced that name right, to be honest. I've been pronouncing it Ernst the entire time, but he is Lennie's father, and in the really beginning he starts off with losing his job, his most recent job, and then he receives a letter from the father of his former friend and fellow soldier from the Vietnam War. He was there for the Vietnam War, and telling him that his son had left 40 acres of land for him up in Alaska, and then he decides to uproot his family and bring them all to Alaska. He essentially made this decision because he thinks that this will be best for him specifically, as well as for his family. And Lennie's mother and Lennie herself, while they were a bit unsure about essentially living off the grid, because that's essentially what happens if you go to Alaska, and becoming self-sufficient, they were willing to make this move mainly because they wanted to keep Ernst happy. And after finalizing their money and their current possessions, they take off to Kanek. I'm hoping I pronounced that name correctly, which is essentially off the coast of the Kenai Peninsula. And upon arrival, Lennie is basically shocked and horrified by how small this town was and what this will mean for her in terms of her social standing as well as her schooling. And it was so small to the point that she was even unsure if there was even a school to start off with, but thankfully there was one, and she ends up meeting a little boy called Matthew Walker, who is the same age as her, and they become fast friends. And in terms of the rest of Lennie's family, shortly after they arrive, they realize that despite all their preparation, they are sorely lacking on materials and money. However, thankfully, with the help of their Alaskan neighbors and close-knit community, they were able to figure out what to do and how to survive this harsh Alaskan winter. However, as I mentioned briefly in the beginning, Ernst had fought in the Vietnam War, and he was actually a prisoner of war. So after he came back, he was essentially a changed man. He had become this volatile man, and any bad and dark weather would set him off. And now that they are in Alaska, where it's essentially dark and winter for about 10 months out of the entire year, Lennie and her mother are afraid what this might mean for them in the winter when it's dark pretty much the entire day. Honestly, if it was me, I would not have gone to Alaska if I knew that was the case. I would have gone to somewhere sunny, like a tropical beach, you know, maybe in this deserted island or something like that. But hey, I guess for this book, they chose to go to Alaska. So again, anyways, with the help of their two closest neighbors, Tom Walker, who is actually Matthew Walker's father, as well as large Marge, Lennie and her mother was able to survive year after year with a special arrangement with Ernst. Until one day when this arrangement no longer works, and after a summer of turbulent emotions and feuds running high between Tom Walker and Ernst specifically, as well as Lennie, who is at that point debating whether or not she wants to go to college, Lennie and her mother are now faced with this raging man who is dead set on cutting them off from society entirely. And as the book continues, a devastating accident occurs and Lennie is at a turmoil as to what had happened. Just when she's somewhat coming to terms with what had happened, another devastating accident occurs, and now Lennie and her mother are struggling to survive. So anyways, this book was so good, definitely a favorite of mine. This is definitely an amazing novel with tons of emotions and feelings, and oh my god guys, it is so good. I tend to enjoy books that are set within a span of a period of time, and this book took place between 1974 to 1986, which really allowed the characters to come to life and the plot to really enrapture you. Kristin really did such an amazing job with creating a fascinating story that is set in such a vivid background. Throughout the book, I was astounded by the lushness and beauty of Alaska, yet at the same time, I was absolutely terrified of ever living there in the winter or visiting there in the winter because any one small accident can be fatal. The characters were amazing, and I absolutely loved Lennie and was really able to connect with her emotions and her conflicts throughout the book. And all the secondary characters, specifically Large Marge, Tom Walker, and Matthew Walker, were also amazing. I mean, they didn't even feel like secondary characters because they all played such pivotal roles. And at the end of the day, I felt that the community up there was almost like my family after reading all about their hardships and what they had to do simply to survive. So I highly recommend this book, and since I actually haven't read any of her books in a while, I definitely had to pick up her most recent one, or her latest one other than this one, which is The Nightingale, ASAP, because this book reminded me of why I love her book so much. So anyways, if this book does sound interesting to you, then definitely go check it out and then come back here to join me for the spoiler section. And if you had read this book, then continue on with me to the spoiler section. So this is a book where after you finish it, you really have to just sit down and absorb everything you've read for a few hours or even a few days, because it's been a few days since I have sat down or finished this book, and now that I'm sitting down, or I was sitting down to compile my thoughts for this book review, I was kind of in this dazed state. So for me personally, I think the best part of this book were the characters themselves. So I'm going to really focus this book review on the characters and not really so much on the plot, but the characters. So let's start off with Lennie. In a way, I feel like she was way more mature than her parents. And despite only being 13 at the beginning of the book, I feel like she was the one making a lot of the more mature decisions, especially where her mother was concerned. And it was especially prominent after the first time jump when it went to 1978 and she was 17 years old. She was the one who was constantly telling her mother and trying to get them to do something about how abusive Ernst was towards her. Yet it was her mother who kept holding her back and couldn't bear to leave Ernst despite how often and how constantly he abused her. Though at the same time though, even though Lennie for the most part was very mature and kept making grown-up decisions, there was one person who kind of made her lose herself and had me really worried about her, and that person was for Matthew. It was really only him where she would often pick the stupid decision, specifically that one time when Ernst and her mother left for a very quick trip, and I guess she thought it would be a fantastic idea for her to kind of escape and go see Matthew, and then obviously Ernst caught them together. So, or the other time when college was so close away, just a few short weeks away, and she was so good until that point when Ernst and her mother decided to go on a day trip, and she thought it would be a perfect idea or the smart move to go and meet up with Matthew and tell him to come back to her place. And so they met up and they ended up falling asleep. So probably not the smartest idea, and they were woken up by Ernst. So again, not the smartest idea. So at the end of the day, I'm just glad that things worked out relatively well, especially with her grandparents and her kid MJ, and that she was able to go back home to Alaska and reunite with Matthew. The second character that I want to discuss is Cora, who is Lennie's mother, and one that I am not a fan of. Honestly, I think she was probably my second to least favorite character after Ernst himself. She was the one who kept making stupid mistake after stupid mistake and ended up jeopardizing her daughter to her monstrous husband. And there were so many times when she could have simply reached out to Tom Walker or Large Marge, who actually kept asking her, do you need help? Because they knew that Ernst was physically abusing her, but every single time she refused them. She was also someone that I couldn't understand at all, because I can't really fathom the idea of being so scared to someone, like being scared to death of someone, yet at the same time loving them so much that you can't leave. It was probably the most toxic relationship I've ever encountered. So at the end of the day, I was just glad that she did have a bar, and that once Ernst crossed that bar with Lennie, she was able to do what needed to be done. And I was also glad to find out that at the end of the book, when she was on her deathbed, she wrote that confession letter, which basically exonerated her daughter to any, crimes committed and any wrongdoing. So because she knew that Lennie really needed to go back to Alaska and to be with Matthew. So I was glad that Cora finally made the right decision, even though it took her so long to get to that point, and it wasn't until she was literally on her deathbed before she did so. So at least she was able to redeem herself at the end of the day. The third character I want to mention is Ernst. He is definitely a character that confused the shit out of me. In the beginning, I definitely sympathized with him because I knew that he was a prisoner of war, and I knew that he had to have undergone some intense torture other, but then bringing them back home and then physically abusing his own wife and later his daughter was a huge no-no for me. So in the beginning, I thought he was just angry a lot. I didn't realize that that anger turned into something physical. So it wasn't until Lennie herself first encountered him hitting Cora, that's when I knew that something was deeply wrong with him inside. So for me, there were really only two conclusions for Ernst for this book. One was to go to jail, but Cora herself couldn't even bring herself to actually charge him from all the abuse he physically, used against her. And so he was able to go free after just like a few hours in the jail cell. Or two, he would have to die, because that was literally the only other solution for Lennie and her mother to become free. Anyways, moving on to the next character, Matthew Walker. Honestly, as much as I like this kid, a part of me can't really fathom the love he had for Lennie and vice versa. So basically, the whole history and relationship between him and Lennie was that they met together when they were 13 years old. They were in the same school together, and they were really good friends for about a year or so until the accident with Matthew's mother happened. And then he went to Fairbanks to live with the rest of his other parts of his family, and they didn't see each other for the next 4 years. And the only communication they had, especially during that time period too, this is the 70s, don't forget, they only had some handwritten letters, and yet somehow it was those handwritten letters that kept that connection. And when they did meet up 4 years later, they were immediately in love with each other. So that's a part that I didn't really understand. So like, I know they exchanged letters, but I just can't imagine that sort of deep love for someone when you only knew them for about a year, and the next 4 years you only communicated with each other via letters. So that deep love is something I cannot imagine from an encounter like that. Not to mention, he was more than willing to risk his own life, and he did risk his own life to save Lennie's, which is also mind-boggling to me. And the craziest part after that, which is even more mind-boggling, is that even after Lennie and her mother escapes and leaves Alaska and basically goes back home to where Cora's parents were at, after 8 years, when Lennie comes back to Alaska, they were still deeply in love. Not to mention that during this 8 years, Matthew didn't even know if she was alive at all. So this is the kind of love that I am extremely cynical of, probably because I just can't imagine it ever happening, but at the same time, it is a love that I deeply admire. And finally, the last two characters I want to mention, Marge and Tom Walker, who are probably the best secondary characters I've ever encountered. I mean, the amount of risk they took upon themselves to help Lennie and her mother, especially with Marge, and how she was always the one who was able to go between the conflict, between the arguments between Cora and Ernst, and was able to always get Ernst to back down, was astounding. And Tom Walker was also great too, especially because of the fact that he was rich and had a lot of supplies and materials. So to be honest, in the beginning, Ernst was most jealous of Tom Walker because of these facts, and whereas Ernst didn't have any money, he didn't have any materials, so he didn't like the fact that they had to rely on him, and he took it as a personal vendetta. And then later on, he also suspected that there was something going on between Tom and Cora, so he had a very intense jealous streak. And so there were a lot more times, more often than not, when Tom Walker was the one who ended up, as well as Cora, who ended up stoking Ernst's like raging jealousy streaks. And even at the end of the book, when Lennie goes back home and essentially confesses everything, the amount of help that Marge and Tom went to go help her, and the amount of the speed that they went to go see her, was astounding. So I'm honestly glad that she had them in her life, because without them, her life could have gone seriously sideways. So anyways, that's all to say for the characters. The ending of the book was actually kind of a bittersweet. I actually really liked the letter that Lennie herself wrote at the very end. I thought it was a very nice touch. It also wrapped things up really well and did confirm the fact that she did end up marrying Matthew and had even more kids with him. So this is definitely a book where I can say that my faith in humanity is restored, even though that this book is fiction, but the amount of work, the amount of effort that the community put in to help Lennie and Cora is just so heartwarming to see. Overall, this is another top favorite of mine, definitely one of my top 10 books for this year. There are so many lessons to be learned in this book: love, family, resilience, durability, etc. So anyways, I highly recommend this book to everyone. I know it's a bit daunting because of the size of it, but honestly it is so worth it. So anyways, that's all I have to say for this book specifically. If you read this book as well and loved it, let me know in the comments below. If you read this book and didn't like it, let me know in the comments below too. I'm really curious as to why perhaps people won't like this book, but I personally love this book. So anyways, that's all I have to say for this book review. If you like this video, please do give me a thumbs up and subscribe down below. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That's it for today, guys. Thank you. Bye.